Part One, Chapter 6 of The Maine Woods by Henry David Thoreau. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part One, Ktaadn, Section 6. At the portage around Ambejijis Falls I observed a pork barrel on the shore, with a hole 8 or 9 inches square cut in one side, which was set against an upright rock; but the bears, without turning or upsetting the barrel, had gnawed a hole in the opposite side, which looked exactly like an enormous rat hole, big enough to put their heads in, and at the bottom of the barrel were still left a few mangled and slabbered slices of pork. It is usual for the lumberers to leave such supplies as they cannot conveniently carry along with them at carries or camps, to which the next comers do not scruple to help themselves, they being the property, commonly, not of an individual, but a company, who can afford to deal liberally. I will describe particularly how we got over some of these portages and rapids, in order that the reader may get an idea of the boatman's life. At Ambejijis Falls, for instance, there was the roughest path imaginable cut through the woods, at first uphill at an angle of nearly 45 degrees, over rocks and logs without end. This was the manner of the portage. We first carried over our baggage, and deposited it on the shore at the other end; then, returning to the batteau, we dragged it up the hill by the painter, and onward, with frequent pauses, over half the portage. But this was a bungling way, and would soon have worn out the boat. Commonly 3 men walk over with a batteau weighing from 3 to 5 or 600 pounds on their heads and shoulders, the tallest standing under the middle of the boat, which is turned over, and one at each end, or else there are 2 at the bows. More cannot well take hold at once. But this requires some practice as well as strength, and is in any case extremely laborious and wearing to the constitution to follow. We were, on the whole, rather an invalid party, and could render our boatmen but little assistance. Our 2 men at length took the batteau upon their shoulders, and, while 2 of us steadied it, to prevent it from rocking and wearing into their shoulders, on which they placed their hats folded, walked bravely over the remaining distance with 2 or 3 pauses. In the same manner they accomplished the other portages. With this crushing weight they must climb and stumble along over fallen trees and slippery rocks of all sizes, where those who walked by the sides were continually brushed off, such was the narrowness of the path. But we were fortunate not to have to cut our path in the first place. Before we launched our boat we scraped the bottom smooth again with our knives where it had rubbed on the rocks, to save friction. To avoid the difficulties of the portage, our men determined to warp up the Passamagamet Falls. So while the rest walked over the portage with the baggage, I remained in the batteau to assist in warping up. We were soon in the midst of the rapids, which were more swift and tumultuous than any we had poled up, and had turned to the side of the stream for the purpose of warping, when the boatmen, who felt some pride in their skill, and were ambitious to do something more than usual for my benefit, as I surmised, took one more view of the rapids, or rather the falls, and, in answer to our question whether we couldn't get up there, the other answered that he guessed he'd try it. So we pushed again into the midst of the stream, and began to struggle with the current. I sat in the middle of the boat to trim it, moving slightly to the right or left as it grazed a rock. With an uncertain and wavering motion we wound and bolted our way up, until the bow was actually raised 2 feet above the stern at the steepest pitch; and then, when everything depended upon his exertions, the bowman's pole snapped in two; but before he had time to take the spare one, which I reached him, he had saved himself with the fragment upon a rock, and so we got up by a hair's breadth, and Uncle George exclaimed that that was never done before, and he had not tried it if he had not known whom he had got in the bow, nor he in the bow if he had not known him in the stern. At this place there was a regular portage cut through the woods, and our boatmen had never known a batteau to ascend the falls. As near as I can remember, there was a perpendicular fall here, at the worst place of the whole Penobscot River, 2 or 3 feet at least. I could not sufficiently admire the skill and coolness with which they performed this feat, never speaking to each other. The bowman, not looking behind, but knowing exactly what the other is about, works as if he worked alone. now sounding in vain for a bottom and 15 feet of water, while the boat falls back several rods, held straight only with the greatest skill and exertion; or, while the sternman obstinately holds his ground like a turtle, the bowman springs from side to side with wonderful suppleness and dexterity, scanning the rapids and the rocks with 1,000 eyes; and now, having got a bite at last, with a lusty shove, which makes his pole bend and quiver, and the whole boat tremble, he gains a few feet upon the river. To add to the danger, the poles are liable at any time to be caught between the rocks and wrenched out of their hands, leaving them at the mercy of the rapids, the rocks, as it were, lying in wait like so many alligators to catch them in their teeth, and jerk them from your hands before you have stolen an effectual shove against their palates. The pole is set close to the boat, and the prow is made to overshoot and just turn the corners of the rocks in the very teeth of the rapids. Nothing but the length and lightness, and the slight draught of the batteau, enables them to make any headway. The bowman must quickly choose his course; there is no time to deliberate. Frequently the boat is shoved between rocks, where both sides touch, and the waters on either hand are a perfect maelstrom. Half a mile above this, two of us tried our hands at poling up a slight rapid, and we were just surmounting the last difficulty, when an unlucky rock confounded our calculations; and while the batteau was sweeping round irrecoverably amid the whirlpool, we were obliged to resign the poles to more skilful hands. Katepskonegan is one of the shallowest and weediest of the lakes, and looked as if it might abound in pickerel. The falls of the same name, where we stopped to dine, are considerable and quite picturesque. Here Uncle George had seen trout caught by the barrelful, but they would not rise to our bait at this hour. Half way over this carry, thus far in the Maine wilderness on its way to the provinces, we noticed a large, flaming oak hall handbill, about 2 feet long, wrapped round the trunk of a pine, from which the bark had been stripped, and to which it was fast glued by the pitch. This should be recorded among the advantages of this mode of advertising, that so possibly even the bears and wolves, moose, deer, otter, and beaver, not to mention the Indian, may learn where they can fit themselves according to the latest fashion, or, at least, recover some of their own lost garments. We christened this the Oak Hall carry. The forenoon was as serene and placid on this wild stream in the woods as we are apt to imagine that Sunday in summer usually is in Massachusetts. We were occasionally startled by the scream of a bold eagle, sailing over the stream in front of our batteau, or of the fish hawks on whom he levies his contributions. There were, at intervals, small meadows of a few acres on the sides of the stream, waving with uncut grass, which attracted the attention of our boatmen, who regretted that they were not nearer to their clearings, and calculated how many stacks they might cut. 2 or 3 men sometimes spend the summer by themselves, cutting the grass in these meadows, to sell to the loggers in the winter, since it will fetch a higher price on the spot than in any market in the State. On a small isle, covered with this kind of rush or cut grass, on which we landed to consult about our further course, we noticed the recent track of a moose, a large roundish hole in the soft wet ground, evincing the great size and weight of the animal that made it. They are fond of the water, and visit all these island meadows, swimming as easily from island to island as they make their way through the thickets on land. Now and then we passed what McCauslin called a pokelogan, an Indian term for what the drivers might have reason to call a poke logs in, an inlet that leads nowhere. If you get in, you have to get out again the same way. These, and the frequent run rounds which come into the river again, would embarrass an inexperienced voyager not a little. The carry around Pockwockomus Falls was exceedingly rough and rocky, the batteau having to be lifted directly from the water up 4 or 5 feet on to a rock, and launched again down a similar bank. The rocks on this portage were covered with the dents made by the spikes in the lumberers' boots, while staggering over under the weight of their batteau; and you could see where the surface of some large rocks, on which they had rested their batteau, was worn quite smooth with use. As it was, we had carried over but half the usual portage at this place for this stage of the water, and launched our boat in the smooth wave just curving to the fall, prepared to struggle with the most violent rapid we had to encounter. The rest of the party walked over the remainder of the portage, while I remained with the boatmen to assist in warping up. One had to hold the boat while the others got in, to prevent it from going over the falls. When we had pushed up the rapids as far as possible, keeping close to the shore, Tom seized the painter and leaped out upon a rock just visible in the water; but he lost his footing, notwithstanding his spiked boots, and was instantly amid the rapids; but recovering himself by good luck, and reaching another rock, he passed the painter to me, who had followed him, and took his place again in the bows. Leaping from rock to rock in the shoal water close to the shore, and now and then getting a bight with the rope round an upright one, I held the boat while one reset his pole, and then all three forced it upward against any rapid. This was warping up. When a part of us walked round at such a place, we generally took the precaution to take out the most valuable part of the baggage, for fear of being swamped. As we poled up a swift rapid for half a mile above Aboljacarmegus Falls, some of the party read their own marks on the huge logs which lay piled up, high and dry, on the rocks on either hand, the relics, probably, of a jam which had taken place here in the great freshet in the spring. Many of these would have to wait for another great freshet, perchance, if they lasted so long, before they could be got off. It was singular enough to meet with property of theirs which they had never seen, and where they had never been before, thus detained by freshets and rocks when on its way to them. Methinks that must be where all my property lies, cast up on the rocks on some distant and unexplored stream, and waiting for an unheard of freshet to fetch it down. Oh, make haste, ye gods, with your winds and rains, and start the jam before it rots. The last half mile carried us to the Sowadnehunk Deadwater, so called from the stream of the same name, signifying running between mountains, an important tributary which comes in a mile above. Here we decided to camp, about 20 miles from the dam, at the mouth of Murch Brook and the Aboljacknagesic mountain streams, broad off from Ktaadn, and about a dozen miles from its summit, having made 15 miles this day. We had been told by McCauslin that we should here find trout enough; so while some prepared the camp, the rest fell to fishing. Seizing the birch poles which some party of Indian or white hunters had left on the shore, and baiting our hooks with pork and with trout as soon as they were caught, we cast our lines into the mouth of the Aboljacknagesic, a clear, swift, shallow stream, which came in from Ktaadn. Instantly a shoal of white chivin, Leuciscus pulchellus, silvery roaches, cousin trout, or what not, large and small, prowling thereabouts, fell upon our bait, and one after another were landed amidst the bushes. Anon their cousins, the true trout, took their turn, and alternately the speckled trout and the silvery roaches swallowed the bait as fast as we could throw in; and the finest specimens of both that I have ever seen, the largest one weighing 3 pounds, were heaved upon the shore, though at first in vain, to wriggle down into the water again, for we stood in the boat. But soon we learned to remedy this evil; for one who had lost his hook stood on shore to catch them as they fell in a perfect shower around him, sometimes wet and slippery full in his face and bosom, as his arms were outstretched to receive them. While yet alive, before their tints had faded, they glistened like the fairest flowers, the product of primitive rivers, and he could hardly trust his senses, as he stood over them, that these jewels should have swam away in that Aboljacknagesic water for so long, so many dark ages. These bright fluviatile flowers, seen of Indians only, made beautiful, the Lord only knows why, to swim there. I could understand better for this the truth of mythology, the fables of Proteus, and all those beautiful sea monsters. How all history, indeed, put to a terrestrial use, is mere history; but put to a celestial, is mythology always. But there is the rough voice of Uncle George, who commands at the frying pan to send over what you've got, and then you may stay till morning. The pork sizzles and cries for fish. Luckily for the foolish race, and this particularly foolish generation of trout, the night shut down at last, not a little deepened by the dark side of Ktaadn, which, like a permanent shadow, reared itself from the eastern bank. Lescarbot, writing in 1609, tells us that the Sieur Champdoré, who with one of the people of the Sieur de Monts ascended some 50 leagues up the St. John in 1608, found the fish so plenty qu'en mettant la chaudière sur le feu, ils en avaient pris suffisamment pour un dîner avant que l'eau fût chaude. Their descendants here are no less numerous. So we accompanied Tom into the woods to cut cedar twigs for our bed. While he went ahead with the axe and lopped off the smallest twigs of the flat leaved cedar, the arbor vitae of the gardens, we gathered them up and returned with them to the boat until it was loaded. Our bed was made with as much care and skill as a roof is shingled. Beginning at the foot, and laying the twig end of the cedar upward, we advanced to the head, a course at a time, thus successively covering the stub ends, and producing a soft and level bed. For us six it was about 10 feet long by 6 in breadth. This time we lay under our tent, having pitched it more prudently, with reference to the wind and the flame, and the usual huge fire blazed in front. Supper was eaten off a large log, which some freshet had thrown up. This night we had a dish of arbor vitae or cedar tea, which the lumberer sometimes uses when other herbs fail. A quart of arbor vitae, to make him strong and mighty. But I had no wish to repeat the experiment. It had too medicinal a taste for my palate. There was the skeleton of a moose here, whose bones some Indian hunters had picked on this very spot. End of Part One, Section 6. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.